Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Associate Curator of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 2, History Behind the Scenes, in which we explore the Rosenbach's remarkable historical collections, travel behind the scenes into the work of the institution to preserve its treasures, and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day American civic life. This episode is the second installment in a mini-series titled Rosenbach Test Kitchen, in which my colleagues and I prepare exquisite culinary dishes inspired by historic menus and letters in the Rosenbach's collection. If you've listened to the last episode of the Rosenbach podcast, you know that the collections department of the Rosenbach, along with our museum's director, Kelsey Bates, is locked in a fierce competition to prepare recipes based on food items we discovered in the Rosenbach's collections. We've focused on two objects in particular, a travel journal kept by a British man named James Moxon as he traveled across the United States in the 1850s, and a handwritten letter in which Thomas Jefferson describes Parmesan cheese. In this episode, the three contestants, Director Kelsey Bates, Registrar Jobi Zink, and I, have met up in Jobi's kitchen to prepare our dishes of choice before they get critiqued, and a winner is selected by our distinguished judges, librarian Elizabeth Fuller and curator and senior director of collections, Judith M. Guston. You've joined us here in the kitchen at the perfect time. We've just put on our aprons and are starting to work on our dishes. Let's check in with the other contestants to see how things are going so far. Jobi, thank you so much for welcoming us into your home and into your kitchen today. Tell me about what you're making and what it's been like to take the items you found in the Moxon journal and turn them into modern-day dishes for us to enjoy.
All right, so I'm actually making 3 different dishes, a cocktail, a vegetable dish, and then dessert. I've had so much fun researching the history of each of these 3 recipes and what that finished product would have contained in 1855. So a peach julep would not have had bourbon at that time. It would have been rum and brandy. And then for asparagus and eggs, I literally sat there and tried to decide what would be the best way to make the eggs, because it just says asparagus with eggs. Is that a fried egg, scrambled eggs? I'm ultimately going to go with a poached egg. And then lemon ice cream was actually a big summertime hit for pretty much the wealthy. And very easy to make.
Interesting.
I did use a Philadelphia style recipe that involves no eggs too, because there are 2 varieties of ice cream. Who knew?
So it sounds like this has been a rewarding experience for you.
I've really had a lot of fun researching, like all of the hotels and what they would have been serving, and you know the utensils and the glasses. It's been a lot of fun. I kind of want to go back to 1855 and dine at the Revere House.
Yes, absolutely. So how confident are you that the dishes as you have prepared them would be recognizable or sort of commensurate to what would have been served in 1855? And to what extent do you feel that there's just this gulf that can't really be traversed because of, say, differences in the biological nature of asparagus today and asparagus then, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I have done no research into the asparaguses of today versus the asparaguses of 1855. I do think that the peach julep is the one that people are going to say, this is a julep? Because as I mentioned, a julep in 1855 would have had brandy or rum and not the typical bourbon that we're used to today. But I think because it's being served in a silver cup, which was like the height of affluence, and it's going to keep your ice, the shaved ice, which again would have been the height of affluence. These are very, very exclusive cocktails, and I think that the julep cup that we're using today is recognizable, and I think that's going to be the key for the judges to know what it is that they're drinking. Alex, tell us about the ingredients you've gathered for your 2 dishes. There's a lot of them. And what is your strategy for preparing them today?
Thank you for asking. So I am preparing 2 different dishes for Rosenbach Test Kitchen. The first of which is a potage à la julienne.
A what?
A potage à la julienne, pretty basic vegetable soup with a cream broth. And I did a fair amount of research to try to find a recipe that would be, to use my own words from the question I asked you, commensurate to what would have been experienced in the period, but also was up to date and modern, because I had some reservations about the vegetable soup after I selected that recipe, thinking, how can I actually make sure that this is somewhat exciting for the judges to enjoy? And so I did find a nice modern recipe for the soup, which I have prepared. The soup is now boiling away on the stove. Vegetables are getting nice and tender, and I think it smells rather nice as well. So I think it'll be a good first course for this meal. Again, I'm a little nervous about it because I don't think that it will be a hit, if you see what I'm saying. We'll see. Maybe the judges will really like it. But I'm really excited about the second recipe that I'm preparing, which is a turkey with oysters. Now, this was also on the Revere House menu, which listeners can find on our website, rosenbach.org/podcast. And this main dish really intrigued me when I first saw it, because I have just never thought of lathering an oyster sauce on top of a roast turkey before. But it seems to make sense, and I did a fair amount of research on this recipe as well, thanks in no small part to your help, Jobi, because you found one recipe for a turkey with oysters that you shared with me from the 1850s that was a roast turkey with oyster stuffing. There seems to have been 2 main ways to make turkey with oysters in this era. One was an oyster stuffing. The other is an oyster sauce, or sort of like a glaze. And I opted for the latter, actually. I thought about it. Kelsey, you prefer...
I think that oyster sauces, I think, are fantastic. The umami that is in an oyster sauce is fantastic on many things. So
yeah.
I'm glad you went that way.
Yeah, I just thought that it seemed more unique. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do something different, I should really try something different. And so... the recipe that I actually ended up using is from Hannah Glass's Art of Cookery, which is a Rosenbach object that Judy discussed on the last episode. That book was published in the 1740s, but I think 1740s to 1850s. I mean, clearly this is a traditional dish, and Hannah Glass's recipe was really easy to follow. So I'm roasting. I didn't buy a whole turkey because there's no way that we would eat a whole turkey together today. I bought a turkey breast roast and stuffed it with onions and thyme, and spiced it with some pepper, some nutmeg, and some cloves per Hannah Glass. But then the oyster sauce I'm very, very excited to make once we conclude this episode. And it will consist of white wine, the oysters themselves, the quote-unquote liquor in which the oysters are the juice of the oysters themselves, and a few other ingredients as well. And in Hannah Glass's recipe, she advises that you keep the oyster sauce separate from the turkey because, quote unquote, everybody don't love oyster sauce. Is what she said.
I think that's probably the truth.
I think it's probably the truth. And so my plan is to present the turkey carved on a nice platter that resembles English Staffordshire transfer printware, which would have been appropriate to the period of the 1850s. Garnish it very beautifully, and then have the oyster sauce on the side. Now, Judy is a vegetarian, and she doesn't eat shellfish. So Judy will have to intellectually assess the recipe, and then Elizabeth will taste it, and we all will taste it as well. So I'm very excited about it. And, I can see how this is going to be a nice flavor combination.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Judy judges it without tasting it.
Right.
And I know that Elizabeth is one of our more adventurous eaters, so she's going to be like, ooh, oysters, haven't had it this way before, so it's going to be great.
Yeah. So I confession, I've never prepared oysters before. So I had the seafood store shuck them for me. That's not a skill that I'm going to try to master in the context of this podcast. But I'm a little nervous also about growing my skills in this new culinary direction, but I think it will be an interesting experience, and I'm looking forward to it.
It's interesting because oysters were ubiquitous around the time that we're talking about, up until the mid 20th century. They were ubiquitous. You didn't go to any restaurant or hotel, dining room without having oysters on the menu. And now here we are in 2022, and it's not uncommon for someone, especially, even someone like you who cooks a lot, to not really know how to shuck an oyster or has never cooked oysters.
Yeah.
It's interesting how food tastes change, depending on many things.
So the funny part about how food tastes change, I right now cannot recall the name of the book that I looked at. It was from 1815. It was a cookbook. I think it's Mrs. Fine's cookbook. And the asparagus with eggs recipe that I was researching is pretty much exactly what it would be today.
Wow.
Salt, pepper.
And some kind of egg. We don't know what kind, but...
I'm going with the poached.
Yeah.
And she had it... In her book, she had asparagus with eggs, and then she had tomato with eggs. And one was poached and one was fried.
Interesting.
If I were making asparagus and egg at home, I would make a poached egg. In fact, I have. I
was going to say, what I didn't do is make bread, because I kind of feel like I want to serve it.
Dip the bread.
Yeah. I'm some dipping.
Yeah.
Next podcast.
Yeah. Well, and this is the fundamental tension of what we're doing here, which is the difference between the intellectual approach, which is trying to be as quote-unquote accurate as possible, and the gastronomical approach, which is thinking about how does this taste the most fantastic that it can be. And I really don't know how our judges are going to come down on this. Maybe they're going to lean more intellectual. Maybe they're going to lean more gastronomical. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I'm hoping for my sake they lean more gastronomical, because I did not go with a historic.
But I think the key is just to tell them the approach that we took.
Right.
Because then they can make that decision as they're making their assessments. So we'll have to see. Kelsey, I know that you've been working on an historically inspired macaroni and cheese, but as you just mentioned, it's something that you've really leaned into putting your own spin on it. Can you tell us a little bit about your recipe and how you prepared the dish?
Yes, I probably went as far away from Thomas Jefferson as you could possibly get, and mostly because the recipe that I read seemed boring. It seemed a little bland. It was just pasta and cheese. And I thought, no, maybe I'll win points for historical accuracy, but I'm not going to win any points for taste. So I decided, I did a little bit more research, and one of the funny things I noticed is that, macaroni and cheese is still, obviously a very popular dish amongst people of all ages. And if you go on TikTok at any given moment, someone is telling you a new way to make macaroni and cheese. And I saw one the other day. It was a video about how to make macaroni and cheese in a slow cooker. And it was pasta and melted cheese and, probably some salt. And I thought, no, we're going back. Now we're going back to Thomas Jefferson. In my opinion, and this is how I made my dish, macaroni and cheese should start with a roux. You need to start with a bechamel sauce. It has to start that way. So I always start with butter and flour. I always add mustard. I always add paprika. And I always use at least 3 different kinds of cheese. In this one I used Fontina. And I like to use Fontina or Gruyere. I think they're both the best. I like to put a little cheddar in it to give it a little sharpness. And then I always top it with Parmesan. And I put it under the broiler so the Parmesan crisps up. That, to me, is the ultimate macaroni and cheese. And I like all the crispy parts. So I basically made the macaroni and cheese that I would make at home. And I did something that I knew the judges might not like, but it's something that my husband and I like. I put cherry tomatoes, little cherry tomatoes in it. And sometimes I also put prosciutto, but knowing we had a vegetarian, I stayed away from that. I just used the tomatoes. So we'll see what the judges think about that. I would say that is a very new take on macaroni and cheese.
Do they know that it's in there?
They do not. It is a secret.
This is so exciting.
Are you going to tell them?
What do you think?
I kind of like the idea of surprising.
Let's surprise them.
Yeah.
I can hear them now. What is this over here?
Yeah.
So I just put them in whole and they break down, and I think they're like little tangy surprises in a very cheesy, because the bechamel sauce and the cheese, it's a heavy, creamy dish, and having a little tangy.
I'm looking forward to trying that. That sounds really
it
fun.
sounds so yummy, and the perfect comfort food for a cold fall day.
Yes.
Yeah.
So sorry, Thomas Jefferson, but I think we have, some things are better, when you look back in history and you think, oh, remember the way we used to do that. Yeah. Macaroni and cheese is not one of those. I think that it falls in the category of, no, we have perfected it. We have figured it out.
Yeah.
So
I think that's so interesting, because if basically my turkey dish, I thought I was going to have to adapt the recipe significantly, and I didn't. Basically, I'm making it the way Hannah Glass said you should roast a turkey and put an oyster sauce on top. Yeah. You had to adapt significantly to update it for the modern palate. That's really interesting.
For sure.
I have a final question for the two of you. What makes you most excited about the dishes you are preparing in terms of how Judy and Elizabeth will respond to them, and what makes you most nervous? Jobi, let's start with you.
Okay, so I am really excited about all of my recipes because, especially compared to the two of yours, I have really simple, basic ingredients, and my seasonings are pretty much salt and pepper. And I know that this works, but I'm also a little bit afraid that it's playing it safe. So for the ice cream, So my ice cream recipe was 3 ingredients. It was lemon, 2 ways. It was zest and juice, cream, and sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Those all sound like perfect ingredients.
I mean, it's so delicious.
Go wrong.
It's so delicious. And the ice cream queen, or I think she was like Queen of Ice, is like, this is her recipe from 1860s. I did add some lemon curd to it that I made earlier, and that just had butter, sugar, and lemon. So now we're up to 4 ingredients.
So Kelsey, what makes you most excited about your dish, and what makes you most nervous?
I'll start with the most nervous. The tomatoes. The tomatoes in there are unusual, and they may throw off the judges, or they may delight the judges. I don't know. So I'll say that's what makes me the most nervous. I think what's most delightful is this whole experiment. I am very much a believer in the fact that sitting down to a meal with other people is one of the most intimate and community building things that you can do.
Yeah.
And I think, even though we all work together all the time, to sit down together and eat a meal together, but it's also a meal that we've all cooked for each other, it's lovely. It makes me very excited, and it is a very nice way to spend a Friday afternoon.
Talk about it. I mean, we are so busy at the Rosenbach all the time that it's really meaningful to take a step back, do something so connected to our work, but also rather distinct from our usual day-to-day life.
Absolutely, yes.
Cool. So I'll share my response to the question as well. I am most excited, and will not surprise listeners to hear, about learning how the oyster sauce actually tastes on top of the turkey. I am not persuaded that it will be delicious. I am persuaded that it will be very, very interesting. And if this works out, I might well have discovered my signature dish. I could see this becoming a Thanksgiving tradition or something.
Yes, that's nice.
But we shall see. I'm most nervous because, not to complain, but I had to write the podcast scripts. I had to bring all my podcast equipment, and I didn't realize how much work it was going to be to both, be directing the podcasting and also cooking at the same time. And we have Andrew Gormley, our videographer here, filming for our teaser trailer. So it has been a hectic day.
Yes.
And it's a lot to accomplish. But I think that at the end of the day, this is going to be a delicious meal.
Well, I think it goes to show just how much work, obviously the podcast adds work to the dishes, to creating the dishes, but it also goes to show that putting together a meal is not easy, not usually easy. It requires lots of forethought. And when you're cooking with other people, you have to put it all together. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's many layers of complexity, but that's okay because it's going to be a delicious meal. Well, thank you, Jobi and Kelsey, very much for participating in this exercise. Thank you for the opportunity to cook together and for being here today on the Rosenbach podcast.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this house smells fantastic. I wish that our podcast listeners could smell. I mean, it smells a little bit like Thanksgiving in here.
That's what I said earlier.
Yeah.
And it's because you use clove and nutmeg in addition to roasting turkey. So there's no pie in the oven, but it kind of has that.
Yeah. It's very cozy.
Ball. Yeah.
It's very cozy. I like it.
Especially on this dreary, gray day.
Yes, which is my favorite kind of day. A cold, dreary autumn day, making delicious food. What could be better than that?
Not much. I think I agree. I'm with you. It's the best kind of day. Yeah.
And just as a note for podcast listeners, we do plan to deposit all of these recipes on our website, rosenbach.org/podcast eventually as well. So at the moment, we can't attest to how delicious they are, but they will be there for you to experiment as well. Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach Museum and Library's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit our reading room. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach Museum and Library and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The theme music for Season 2 of the podcast is a setting of the poem Longings, written by poet, artist, and educator Nellie Rathbone Bright in 1927. Bright co-founded the Black Opals, a collective and literary journal showcasing young black writers in Philadelphia in the late 1920s. The musical version featured here was performed by Yolanda Wisher, Paul Geis, V. Shane Frederick, Mark Anthony Palacio, and Sir Lance Gamble.
I want to flee to a cool city.
The Rosenbach podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about history on the next episode of the Rosenbach Podcast.
In the heart of me, drums in my ears, and my lips are wet with the tang of the sea.